It's the week ending Friday the 30th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the US Trade Court blocking President Trump's tariffs, Thames Water being fined nearly £123 million for breaching rules over sewage spills, and Gary Lineker presenting his final match of the day after 26 years in the job. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Arion McNicoll. From BBC Sport, it's journalist Emma Smith, and we welcome back journalist and campaigner Elizabeth Carr-Ellis. And Elizabeth, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Do we have a new Iron Curtain, only this time made of ice?
The Arctic was once a distant, frozen expanse. Few paid it much attention. Now, this is changing rapidly. The Arctic is awakening from its icy slumber. Climate change is the primary catalyst for this shift. The ice is melting. New possibilities are emerging. Global powers are watching the Arctic with keen interest. They see new opportunities unfolding before them. These opportunities are economic and strategic. The region is no longer a frozen wasteland. It is a dynamic arena.
Arctic power struggle. China, Russia, US and Europe clash for control. A video from Mosin Insights. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Elizabeth, the Arctic is no longer a frozen wasteland, the voiceover man tells us. What's the story?
It's not, and that's about our planet. It does sound like the start of the next Star Wars film, I have to admit. This week, a new report from the World Meteorological Organization found that the Arctic is now warming at more than 3 times the global average. So when you hear about, heat and temperatures, you think serious ice melt, raising sea levels, shifting weather patterns. But what's most interesting about this to me is this is not just a climate story. This is how the climate is changing our geopolitical world. As the ice disappears, it is revealing vast reserves of oil, gas and minerals. Now, the Arctic is thought to hold as much as 22% of the world's undiscovered oil and gas. So Russia and Canada in their Arctic areas are extracting 2.5 million barrels of fossil fuels every day. That means there's up to 157 billion barrels of oil estimated to still be in the Arctic region. And so this is a huge ching-ching money grab for a lot of countries. Not only that, Europe's largest deposit of rare earth elements. Now, these are the things that we need for smartphones, wind turbines, MRIs, those sort of things. That was discovered in the Swedish Arctic, and Canada has discovered large deposits on its northern territory as well.
Okay, so just define for us for a second, to take us right back to basics. Mm-hmm. When we are talking about the Arctic, where are we talking about geographically? Like, what are the countries that neighbour it?
The Arctic is the region around the North Pole, so it covers parts of 8 countries. So you have the US, Canada, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. Now that's Denmark via Greenland, no matter what Mr. Trump is saying, and of course Iceland as well. Who actually owns the Arctic is a bit murkier.
Okay, and that is, I guess, in a sense, Arion, what's up for grabs. It's not just about the natural resources, though, is it? It's also about the trade routes.
Yeah, exactly. And those trade routes are emerging because, again, as Arctic sea ice continues to retreat due to climate change, this region that was once just completely impenetrable is beginning to offer these new maritime passages that could dramatically reshape global trade. And chief among them are the Northern Sea Route, which is along Russia's Siberian coast, and the Northwest Passage, which goes through Canada's Arctic archipelago, which together could shorten shipping routes between Asia and Europe and North America by thousands of kilometres compared to the traditional paths through the Suez and Panama canals. And this reduction in travel time translates to lower fuel costs and quicker delivery of goods and potentially billions in economic savings for shipping and logistics companies. So it's this massive opportunity for the companies and the countries that get access to it.
And therefore, I suppose, Emma, a difficult decision for countries like Greenland. in terms of whether they reach out to China for support or not. It's obvious why the Chinese might be interested, but obviously it's also the case that Greenland might not want to involve yet another superpower in the battles over their territory.
Absolutely. Yes, once again, Greenland is in the headlines. And obviously, being a country without a huge amount of resources being able to access, these raw materials themselves, they have to look to elsewhere. And you think that in most circumstances they might look to the USA, which is their nearest sort of superpower neighbour, but given the state of Greenland-USA relations of late, that's maybe not entirely likely. And also there's the issue of looking to Europe, because there's a growing independence movement in Greenland to gain independence from Denmark, so whether or not they would look to a region where they're looking to distance themselves in many ways in international relations might not happen. So where do they turn? And China, which is a nation which is always looking to expand its sphere of influence, they readily make themselves available.
Yeah. Do they need support at all, actually, though, Elizabeth? I mean, I use that word. If they've got all these natural resources in that region and they've got the world's countries fighting for access to them, then maybe support's the wrong word. It's a case of, it's a bidding war.
It is a bidding war. I mean, we have a trade war going on. I made the joke about Star Wars, but it is very much the start of a new trade war going on. I mean, it seems crazy talking about China. China's calling itself a near-Arctic state. It has no Arctic coastline at all. And it's not just China. We have India, who is also wanting to get involved,
That is far away. My geography is not amazing, but I know that India is not in the Arctic.
Even my CSE 3 tells me that India is not in the Arctic. But, they're saying they have a scientific and global responsibility to be involved, And I'm thinking, you're also thinking of all of the money that you get. Because of the position of Europe and what's going on, we're seeing Russia and China teaming up. They've already done military manoeuvres. They're the ones working on the Northern Sea route. And that's having a knock-on effect with other ones. So there you have Greenland, which America is saying, yes, they should belong to us because we need it for our security. Now, you can understand Trump saying that when you understand what's been going on with Russia and China. But at the same time, NATO is very aware of what's been going on with Russia and China up in the Arctic as well. So they're wanting to get involved. You have increasing military presence from Denmark as well. So it's turning into a little hotbed, which is not just because of global warming.
It's interesting, the India thing, isn't it, Arion? I mean, it was sort of all laughing because it feels like an overreach. But then India is an emerging superpower, and how did superpowers get power in the first place? Partly through territory all over the world, including our country, including owning India. So it's kind of like, well, if they're going to compete with the likes of Britain and America, why not? Why shouldn't they have access to what former superpowers have, which was access to parts of the world that they weren't related to at all geographically? I mean, that's kind of what's always happened if Greenland and Norway are happy about it.
For sure. And India, even though it is less active, maintains Arctic research bases and recently released its first Arctic policy emphasizing science and sustainability. You'll be unsurprised to know. I mean, that's the funny thing, that every single country that's operating up there talks about its scientific contribution, its interest in the polar bears and the melting of the ice caps. But actually what they're doing there is so much this geopolitical tussle. And, for India itself, while their interests align with global stakes in Arctic developments, that the reality is that some Arctic nations, especially the US and Canada, view the interests of India and also China's ambition with enormous suspicion, and they're concerned about this dual use strategy which could lead to a kind of greater military or strategic influence in the region. So they're all up there talking about their science, but actually what they're doing is building these, two things. They're building and operating these massive new opportunities to exploit the resources, but they're also sending up these ships that can plough paths through the ice to open up trade routes.
Emma, is it another nail in the coffin for net zero? It's kind of a depressing theme of this show over the last 10 years is that people thought that we were heading towards a consensus on climate change, but it sounds like all of the world's major powers have an interest in accelerating it so they can put ships through the Arctic.
Yes, the world is interested in heading towards climate change until they discover that the Arctic contains 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas resources, and then all of a sudden the idea of going for net zero and more sustainable energy suddenly goes out the window when you suddenly discover that there's an opportunity of discovering more fossil fuels. And you'd hope that at some point, there would be lessons to be learned about this sort of thing and about being able to sort of access these materials in a more sustainable manner. But when there's such a jackpot up for grabs, those considerations tend to go out the window very quickly.
It's true. I mean, these countries are talking about sustainability, but their actions are just saying drill, baby, drill. They can talk about wanting to look after the planet and scientific research, but when it comes to the people who truly do look after the planet, when you think about the indigenous nations that have a much closer connection with Mother Nature than what we do, their views are being thrown out the window. So yeah, sadly, it's a huge contradiction. Climate change is melting the ice, and that melts opening up fossil fuels, and that's just going to make climate change worse. And the big nations are saying, oh well, never mind.
Yeah, I mean, just finally on this, Elizabeth, you mentioned earlier you can sort of see why Donald Trump is interested in buying Greenland. And, maybe it doesn't seem so ridiculous when you put it in the context of all of these global competitors. It's sort of hard to imagine America and its allies allowing anyone else to have control over that area for all the reasons we've described, isn't it? Whether they get there through purchasing Greenland or through some other kind of means involving science or the military or whatever. But it is obviously, like I say, when you look at it on a map, such a crucial pathway in that region of the world.
And that's why it is such a big thing, because it is such a crucial pathway, And we do have the Arctic Council, and that's the main international body for cooperation on Arctic issues. And that has a strong voice in what's happening. So you would imagine that if the US were to take over Greenland, then the Arctic Council would still be having its voice, because, it's several countries. Of course, now with Ukraine, Russia is no longer a member of the Arctic Voice, which gives US a little bit more control and to sign it up. But when you see all of the fights that have been going on around the fishing waters, we get down to things like who owns this little bit of continental shelf. I don't think it will be that easy for the US just to take it over and then say, it's ours, guys, get lost.
Okay. Up next, if you asked ChatGPT to design you an iPhone, what would it come up with? That's after this. Okay, Arion, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, the man who created the iPhone hinted that he may be about to kill the iPhone.
I think we have the opportunity here to kind of completely reimagine what it means to use a computer.
Sam is a rare visionary. He shoulders incredible responsibility, but his curiosity, his humility remain utterly inspiring.
Jony is the deepest thinker of anyone I've ever met. What that leads him to be able to come up with is unmatched.
A promotional video released by OpenAI last week. Arion, who were we hearing from there, and what's the story this week?
Okay, so we are hearing from Jony Ive, the legendary Apple design guru who built the iPhone and the iPod and numerous Macs and pretty much defined...
Sir Jony Ive, please.
Sorry, I
when
should...
in Britain.
Well, no, actually, on the week we don't use honorifics, so it's just
right,
Jony
okay,
to us.
Forgive me. Have a chat with the sub-editors.
But anyway, he pretty much defined the way we use computing devices. And the other person we're hearing from is Sam Altman, who's the CEO CEO of OpenAI, which is, of course, the company behind ChatGPT. And what happened this week was that the tech press went into an absolute frenzy of speculation about what, having announced a $6.5 billion merger last week, these pair of very influential people are planning. And what they've said themselves was that they're designing some kind of new device. But in truth, their announcement was more kind of the announcement that there'll be an announcement like down the track rather than an actual tech unveiling. But that hasn't stopped like widespread theorization about what they're plotting. And the message of that lavish launch video was pretty unmistakable. Altman is being cast as the new Steve Jobs, and he and Ive are setting out to build the next transformative personal device, which would be a kind of heir to the iPhone's legacy, both its cultural and technological legacy.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll talk about all of that in a second. Just briefly, though, like how the story has developed this week. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this, but basically it's about the investors in this new hybrid company between ChatGPT and Jony Ive, isn't it? And whether they've been shady about their business interests.
Yeah, there was this really interesting feature in Futurism this week, which reported on the fact that in December, Klarna founder Sebastian Siemiatkowski quietly invested $5 billion into a handful of AI startups. That's not very unusual, but 70% of that, a massive $3.6 billion of his investment, went to a totally anonymous company. Again, not totally unusual, but still intriguing. And then fast forward 6 months and that mystery's been solved, which is that the secret startup is IO, which is the stealth project from Jony Ive, which has gone through this merger. But the weird twist this week that Futurism was talking about was that tech insiders like Sutter Hill Ventures were other major backers, but then they oddly deleted posts celebrating the deal having gone through. And it's just sort of raised questions about why there is all of this secrecy about the device. Maybe it's because like the device that is being planned is still under wraps, but maybe also it's a hint that there is some uncertainty about whether the investors behind it are going to be able to recoup what they have put in after the hype phase and when the actual reveal emerges.
Yeah, I wonder as well, Emma, whether there are ethical concerns. And I say that because even in that promotional video, even in the first few seconds as we heard there, one of the quotes the people making the video chose to use from Jony Ive was talking about how Sam Altman has great responsibility. Great responsibility, why? Well, because we all know that AI does weird renegade things when you ask it questions, right? And people are asking it increasingly complex ones. And a new device is only going to accelerate that.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely an issue around the fact that this is being set up as being the next big thing, and this is, going to be the next step forwards in technology in humankind. I mean, just hearing the promo video, it's enough, I was fairly skeptical before, and that's only increased. We get told a lot of times that there's going to be the new big thing, the next great sort of technological advancement, and then it ends up being
3D TVs.
Yeah, or something like that. Or, AI search results on Google, which, suggests that pregnant women should smoke 3 to 5 cigarettes a day and stuff like that. And I mean, and this feature that from Futurism that Arion pointed us to was really interesting because it also, it highlights how a lot of these sort of very hyped up tech projects often lead to dead ends. I mean, last year there was a product from AI startup Humane, which was incredibly well backed, up to the tune of $100 million for something called the Pin, which was basically something you could wear on like your lapel that would you could ask questions. It was basically like translate things. It was like a portable Google Home or something. The reviews were, and it was going to cost you $700 and plus subscriptions to various, and it was basically. It basically didn't work.
Just to cut through the review there.
Yeah, basically. The speaker wouldn't pick up half the time when it was asked questions. It would, the translation feature wouldn't work properly. It would, if you it would search for things that were unrelated to what it was asked, or pick up on things that it wasn't supposed to. It just didn't work properly. I mean, obviously, this partnership that Arion's highlighted, it's between at least two incredibly successful intelligence men, but until we see the final product and see how it actually works, I think it should be taken with a grain of salt about how influential this might end up being.
Elizabeth, are you excited about a new device from Jony Ive backed by OpenAI's intelligence?
No, it's just, there are so many of these devices going around, and they're going to change your life, and then they just become one more thing that makes your life more stressful or doesn't tell you the right thing. I just think these are wonderful gadgets for men with important roles in the city, so they can look flash. Just think back to the late 80s, early 90s, when you used to have them wandering around London with their bricks, talking because they were the new mobile phones. It's just that same sort of thing. It's going to revolutionize our lives. And like I might say, they're usually pretty rubbish, and you don't use all the features on them, and they don't revolutionize your life.
Oh, you can't. Okay, all right. You can't honestly be saying the iPhone's rubbish, can you? We're talking about the man who designed the MacBook Pro, the iPhone, the Apple Watch.
They're
not
going
rubbish.
To say
they're very good at what they do.
They're not rubbish in the sense that they're rubbish, but I still have problems in my life. My smartphone is not going to change that. And AI is not going to change that. It doesn't even make me healthier. I got told by one of my apps the other day, congratulations, you've done a workout. I'd walked to the pub.
Well, isn't it just a smart speaker? I mean, we're dancing around the fact. Isn't it just a smart speaker that's good? Because I have a smart speaker and I like it, but it's best at just asking to play a radio station or set an egg timer. But if you put really good AI into a smart speaker, then that would be incredibly useful. It would just be AI in the air, wouldn't it?
Definitely. Or more like, the information somehow putting itself straight into your brain. Like if you could have, for example, AI helping you with your day-to-day life. And maybe, I don't see the problem personally with the Google Glass solution. The one time I tried it, I could immediately see why that was great to have directions, for example, just layered over my ordinary sight.
Do not want a computer stapled to my face, thank you.
No, but I mean, imagine they could find a way to get, for example, the names of the people who you've forgotten into your head without you having to look at your phone to try to remember them, or whatever it is. I just think that would be incredible.
Emma, what does Jony Ive's involvement actually tell us about his mindset? Because, he seems really keen on this. He's obviously got one big project left in him, and a lot of people would have thought, if you invent the iPhone, you can kind of chill out for a bit. Yeah,
and I mean, as you referred to, Jony Ive has not just designed the iPhone, he's designed most of the Apple products which are now sort of part of our day-to-day lives, like things like the iPod, Apple Watch, AirPods, incredibly, ubiquitous, successful items. It's interesting, though, that he seems to be, gearing up for this huge project. And it's interesting what he's been saying as well, because he's been quite critical of the iPhone and basically about its role in our increasing dependence on smartphones. Now, obviously, he's no longer, working for Apple, so he can be maybe a bit more free about, criticising a contender. But it's interesting because it sort of joins the ranks of tech, incredibly successful people in tech who've then been quite critical of their work. You look at someone like Geoffrey Hinton, who's regarded as the godfather of AI for his work at Google. When he resigned, he was very critical of modern AI, things like AI chatbots, calling them quite scary, and discussing his worry about how some people were increasingly relying on these chatbots for, basic information or companionship. So it's interesting how Ive has approached this. He's seemingly going, for something that he's built, is being built up as being his sort of, his magnum opus, as you say, his one last big project. But what he said, when you sort of read between the lines, is quite interesting, and it is worth, perhaps, despite my skepticism, keeping an eye on it and seeing what transpires.
I mean, the sort of ogres are never named, are they, Elizabeth? The designers of these products often later say, I wish my product hadn't been used in that way. But then, when you see the launch of a new one, it's not like he's openly saying, And this one, we're going to make sure that people don't get addicted to gambling and pornography and self-harm and, divisive political groups. They're not saying that. So you think, well, if they're not openly, if that's not part of the mission statement, then it's just going to happen again, but more so.
The evidence of how harmful smartphones have been is around us every day. So, yeah, it's great that Jony Ive's saying, oh, I wish I hadn't done it now. But he did, and he's still going around, as in that clip, saying we are intelligent, forward-thinking, men who are going to change the world. But your last attempt to change the world increased young people's depression, sleepless nights, kids are getting bullied outside of school because of it. That didn't change.
It did also spawn podcasts, to be fair. So
well,
we wouldn't be here if he hadn't.
Every cloud has a silver lining, But it's not enough just to open Pandora's box and then say, oops, and then turn to another possible Pandora's box and say, but this one's not going to be the same. You have to learn from your mistakes. And I'd much rather he was doing some of the stuff that he's been doing with his Love From, which is looking at just design in general and how design can make your life better rather than design with technology can make your life better.
That's his startup, isn't it? What's it called? Love From,
yes, his startup, which is a collective of designers and architects and musicians and what have you. And they've done some really good stuff, I like what they've been doing. I would much rather we looked at how design can actually improve your life rather than how design can make you want to have technology improve your life. The idea of I'm menopausal, I forget people's names all the time. But the idea of having a little AI voice in my head going, that's Olly, is frightening.
You'd never forget my name, Elizabeth.
Never.
Okay. Up next, what defines a woman? Keir Starmer says we now have clarity. But do we? That's after this. Okay, Emma, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, the clarity brought by the Supreme Court became even murkier.
What I think in a time like this is no one knows what the best set of actions is to get trans people's rights. Like, if we were to run a simulation of the universe 1 billion times and make a different decision at every decision point, some of them would get to the point of trans people having human rights faster than others. So there's like an optimal route through this.
Trans YouTuber Katie Montgomery in a video released on Sunday. Emma, what's happened this week?
So this week saw a story in The Guardian saying that formal guidance on how organisations should implement the Supreme Court judgment on gender may not be fully ratified for months, and it comes amid concerns over the capability of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which is the organisation that would be responsible for providing the guidance on which the government would then look to make laws based from the Supreme Court judgment.
Yeah, okay, so for people who haven't been following this, the Supreme Court in Britain ruled this year that woman in the Equality Act refers only to a biological woman. Keir Starmer then said, that's clarified things for everybody, but the issue is, what does that mean? What is that clarity? Because it's still not actually been decided on a case-by-case basis.
Yes, so potted history of a very sort of complicated story. So the Supreme Court ruling on April the 16th, which was, as you say, sort of clarified that under law, the definition of woman defines someone who is born female. It was quickly followed by interim guidance from the EHRC with a 2-week consultancy period before the full guidance was going to be released, and then followed up by it being implemented into law. That's now been extended to 6 weeks with a full sort of public consultation period, and then there's now talk that it may not be implemented for several months. So and the EHRC has come into criticism for the guidance, which was seen as being rushed out and overly simplistic, and what in the days following the Supreme Court ruling was, as you mentioned, Keir Starmer welcomed it as being providing clarity and as being the end of as he put it, a long debate. That increasingly does not seem to be the case.
Well, you can tell us from experience, Emma, as a trans woman, what has the impact been on people like you?
I've had better months and a half. It has been extremely difficult and stressful at times. It was interesting. One of the key notes from the judges at the Supreme Court was that this was not a triumph of one group over another. You could have fooled me with the gender critical campaigners popping champagne out the court and J.K. Rowling celebrating with a cigar on her boat. It's been a time of, I mean, a great deal of stress and feeling, sometimes very, very low. But it's interesting because...
But why? Like, beyond the psychological impact of feeling that the other side has won, if you like, the actual practical thing that was decided, basically, I mean, just to get to the actual practicalities of it, are where women like you are supposed to go to the toilet. That's the thing that was decided. And the answer is, you're now supposed to go to the men's. What's been the practical experience of that?
Well, nothing's changed, and that's the point. There's no law's been changed, so I'm just carrying on as normal, and that's what everyone should be really just carrying on as normal, because there hasn't been anything changed. And that's in the end the point that I was coming to, was that yes, it could be sort of very stressful and worrying time, but then it's like you take a step back and you realise actually nothing has really changed, and all we have is a time when there's said, it's going to be clarity and there's going to be and this and that. It's just a lot of talk and not a lot of. And
Arion, talk us through the lady who at the moment might have a significant impact on this judgment about how this is implemented into British law, Baroness Falconer.
Yeah, so Baroness Falconer has served as the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, since December in 2020. And under her leadership, there's been an enormous amount of criticism, particularly from LGBTQ plus advocacy groups, as well as some political figures, and especially over its stance on transgender rights. She was also a Liz Truss appointee, which doesn't really smell very good, considering how that premiership went. But
she did something.
Well, yeah, but she's also been at the centre of internal controversies within the EHRC of her own creation, because in 2023, a dossier containing around 40 complaints from current and former EHRC staff accused her of bullying, harassment, and, quote, fostering a toxic culture within the organisation. The independent review that followed was unable to reach any conclusions, and it was closed without any action being taken against Falconer. But in the meantime, questions are being raised about the adequacy of keeping her on, and particularly with her overseeing this guidance, which was being, in the first instance, as we said, being rushed through in 2 weeks, and then Parliament insisted that limit was extended out to 6 weeks. But altogether, there is this move, particularly within Labor, to try to wait on the guidance and wait until a Labor appointee, probably Harriet Harman, can be put in place, replacing her in September, and then for guidance.
I didn't know it was going to be Harriet Harman. I hadn't heard that. That doesn't feel to me like that would make the situation any less divisive.
Well, given who Falconer is, it probably would. But it's anyway. But that as well kind of gives you a snapshot of the way that this clarity that Starmer would like to claim is actually entirely lacking in any sort of clear view of what the future should be within Labor and the Lib Dems. Everyone is just up in arms, not sure what to do with this.
I mean, Elizabeth, you're a former Labour councillor. What do you make of how your party are dealing with this?
I think they're dealing with it as well as they can, because there is such divide and hate on both sides from this that, you have to tread carefully. I expressed unease at this because as a former Labour councillor, I've had attacks on social medias from both sides. I've had failed threats. Nothing serious, not compared to some people, but
threats because you defend biological sex.
Yes, because I defend biological sex, because I'm a health campaigner ultimately, and it's vital to know, have your sex written down for some health concerns. It's as simple as that. It doesn't mean that I view a trans woman as less than me in any way at all. It just means that, I need to go for one type of cancer checks, and a trans woman needs to go for another kind of cancer checks. It's as simple as that. And I were a bit, in the past, perhaps my views were a little bit more turfish, but over time, and as I've talked to people and as I've spoken to people, I went to a prison and there was a trans woman who had self-imposed solitary on herself because she didn't feel comfortable. It was a male prison. She didn't feel comfortable there, but she understood why she wasn't in the female prison as well. So she just stayed in her cell all day. And as a politician, as I was at the time, that broke my heart. That is not what we're there to do. And, the Supreme Court ruling says that for the basis of the Equality Act, woman means adult, human, female. In the Equality Act lays out protected characteristics, and gender identity is also a protected characteristics. To me, I don't think the Supreme Court ruling was saying one side is higher than the other side.
I should say that in terms of what Elizabeth was saying, she's absolutely right in terms of obviously there's different health concerns and they should have to be taken care of. I've had gender recognition certificate, and since then I've had letters from the doctor inviting me to cervical smears, which obviously I don't need. And then the other day I was in the doctor's for a blood test, and the nurse came out and asked me if I was there for the midwife consultation. And I was like, well, on one hand she looked good because it looks like I could get pregnant. On the other hand, do I look pregnant? Do I need to lose a little bit of weight here? But
that's a really good example of a practical thing where there clearly should be some mid option which indicates exactly what you are. I'm a trans person who has a gender recognition certificate, therefore the things that apply to biological females don't apply to me. There needs to be some guidance on it. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? Yeah,
but the thing is that it kind of just works. The system works fine already. I mean, like things like, obviously I get, like the blood tests that I was having were because of like things for the hormones that I take. And obviously, and there's obviously there going to be notes on my file.
So that actually in your case you do find that there is already a case-by-case distinction and it's not necessary to have a big debate about it.
Exactly. And I think that this is... The whole thing has been a solution looking for a problem. And as a result, it's reached the point in which, things like, as Elizabeth says, things like obviously things like biological woman, which is obviously in itself a perfectly justifiable and perfectly fine phrase. It's become a weighted phrase because of the way it's been used, and that's unfortunately where we are.
But on the issue itself, and I'm sorry to keep returning to toilets, but again, as this pertains to most people listening and looking at the ruling, it is literally about bathrooms. On that, the ruling that says women's toilets of biological women, does that need to be any further finessed? Because I mean that is clear then, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's when you get to the point of there's so many issues. I mean, first of all, saying that if you're born male, you should use male toilets. If you're born female, you should use female toilets. Okay, obviously that puts like trans people in a certain amount of danger. But then it's like, how does that? But then the guidance itself says that trans people should not be put in a position where there are no facilities for them to use, and if they're not sort of feeling safe to use a certain, like, it's what do they do? I mean, like Kemi Badenoch has suggested that should use the disabled toilets. I mean, Lady Faulkner herself said that trans people should campaign for third spaces, which doesn't seem particularly helpful from the chair of the EHRC. And then what impact is it going to have on cisgender men or female who don't necessarily gender conforming? I mean, and how is it going to be enforced? I mean, Pat McFadden on the Lauren McCoonsberg show said that there's not going to be toilet police, and obviously that's a good thing because that would just be horrendous.
No, but it leaves people feeling entitled to say you shouldn't be in here. I suppose that's the risk, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that feeling of entitlement to police these spaces based on your very specific idea of what gender should look like. I think that's a very good space for us as a society to be in.
Arion, what do you think it means corporately? I'm just curious about this because, a lot of businesses, big businesses, Barclays, for example, made decisions based on what Sir Keir Starmer said was clarity. Do you think they're now going to have to potentially reverse on those things?
Well, potentially, yeah. I saw a really interesting bit of commentary from Christine Burns, who's one of the UK's best-known trans rights advocates, who said that, like putting a blanket ban on trans women using women's facilities was, quote, an incredibly dangerous statement given that they gave no indication on how that should be enforced. And she said, again, quote, making service providers the enforcers without training, it means their staff will be sent out to use their imagination as vigilante toilet police. And that kind of echoes what both Emma and Elizabeth were saying about the idea of this being taken into the hands of individuals. But for the corporate world, I think it remains an absolute minefield. There is no sense of where the law is ultimately going to fall yet, but neither you feel should the corporate world be ruling on something that's as fundamental as this.
And Emma, if you're listening to that and thinking, oh, crikey, I work for a business and I've got to make a decision on this, where would you recommend people actually go to follow news on this that isn't from one side or the other, that is just, telling us what the latest developments are and how to try and implement them?
Well, they should go to the BBC and they should go to the Week, obviously.
There we are.
Yes. I mean, in terms of it's obviously a lot of news websites, have sort of political lines. And I mean, I don't want to sort of suggest, you should follow this person on social media or that, because ultimately, people can get things wrong, and I don't want to sort of start judging one sort of news outlet over the other. All I would say is that it's good to stay informed, but make sure, particularly if you are a trans person, don't spend all your time worriting online about this. Go out, speak to people. And I would say, just end this on I've obviously brought this story because it's a slight personal connection. I've had so many people sort of checking on me, check that I'm okay, saying that we think that things haven't really changed as far as we're concerned in terms of our personal relationships, and that's been great. And I'm sure that if you're listening and you've been worried about this, as it's the same thing for you. So yes, stay informed, but also go outside and turn off social media.
Yes, that's a good point. It more elegantly says what I was trying to say earlier, which is I think for a lot of people, they have a view on this because they feel they should, because there's a debate. And actually, on a case-by-case basis with individuals they know, they'd say something very different. My thanks to you, Emma, and to Arion, and to Elizabeth. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, and then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.